As most of you know, Jerry Oliver is past president of our Rotary Club. Since leaving us, temporarily we hope, he's become a professor of practice at the School of Public Affairs and academic director for the Master of Public Safety, Leadership, and Administration, which is part of the Watts College at ASU. Jerry has an undergraduate degree in criminal justice and a master's degree in public administration, both from ASU. He was born and raised in Phoenix, and he started out as a junior officer on the street with the Phoenix Police Department, rising to the level of assistant chief of police before leaving Arizona to become the chief of police in Pasadena, California, Richmond, Virginia, and Detroit, Michigan. I want you to please join me in welcoming Jerry once again to our club for this very special joint meeting of the Rotary 100 Main Club and the Downtown Social Club. The format for this evening's meeting is all question and answer. I'm going to start it out asking Jerry a few questions.
I wanted to just add a few more things about my history that might be relevant to some of the conversation that we will have, the Q&A that we'll have, because in all honesty, this should be an enlightening but an uncomfortable conversation between all of us Rotarians who really spend our lives trying to do good. So I was, as Brooks said, I was born here in Phoenix. I'm a native Phoenician. I was born in the 40s. In the 40s and the 50s, as any of you that's sort of in my cohort group, in my age group would know, that's during the height in Arizona of the Jim Crow era. And I won't educate you about Jim Crow other than to say that that was a period of time when there was really a lot of separation between the races, and it was intentional, and it was at times very mean, and at times I think totally unfair. It is what the systems that we're still dealing with come out of, Jim Crow. And so I grew up here in Phoenix in the 50s, and also experienced the turbulent 60s. And for some of you, that's before you came along, but the 60s was a period of time when we had 3 assassinations of very important people in this country: President Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. It was a time of voting rights acts. It was a time of civil rights legislation. It was a time of riots after Martin Luther King was killed. It was a time of turbulence in this country that we probably have not seen since, even with the times that we're having now. And in that period of time, I came along, I guess I came into my own, or as people say sometimes, that that's when I grew into adulthood. I graduated from Phoenix Union High School, which is right downtown Phoenix now, where ASU is. I was graduated 10th in my class. Phoenix Union High School had just recently, in 1965 or in 1961, just recently integrated, and they closed down Carver High School. So I was part of the first groups of students that went to Phoenix Union High School and helped to cause what was known then as white flight from downtown Phoenix, because many of the white families started to move east and north. I also graduated, as I said, 10th in my class, and I went to University of Arizona on an academic scholarship, full academic scholarship. But that was the height of the Vietnam War, also controversial. So my friends and I left University of Arizona and joined the Vietnam War. Left United States and wound up in Vietnam for 3.5 years or 3 years, and then came back. And because of the, I guess, patriotism, really, I wanted to continue my service, and so I joined the Phoenix Police Department. And as Brooks said, spent 20 years there, left there as the assistant police chief, the executive assistant police chief in Phoenix, went to Memphis as the public safety director, was police chief in Pasadena, California, Richmond, Virginia, and Detroit, before returning here and occupying some state level positions with Governor Napolitano, and now I'm at Arizona State. I wanted to say that. I wanted to give you a little bit more background because I'm not telling you about, when I talk, I'm not telling you about something that I read. I'm sharing with you, not speaking on behalf of all Black people or not speaking on behalf of all police officers, but as a person who has had an opportunity, a rare opportunity to experience as a African-American male, as a police officer, and then as a police leader across this country. I have some observations that I will share with you. And as I said, hopefully this will be enlightening. If it's not enlightening, hopefully it will be uncomfortable, because I think that's when as we stir the waters, that's when we'll get waves that will make a difference. So with that, Brooks, you're on with the first question.
Thank you for those very nice words, Jerry. I'm proud to have you as my friend. And thank you so much for agreeing to meet with us tonight. The last time you addressed Rotary on police practices, you used the term awful but lawful to describe things that had gone on at Ferguson, Missouri, and other places. When I wrote to you a few weeks ago, I used the phrase awful but lawful as my subject in my email. But when you wrote back, you changed the subject to awful and unlawful. Can you explain why?
You know, Brooks, when I spoke to the Rotary Club before, our Rotary Club before, it was a time actually before many of the innovations, quote unquote, that we've had in law enforcement. It was a time before body cameras that many police officers now wear. And it was certainly a time before it was video cameras in the hands of citizens or in the hands of others than police officers was prevalent. So we had to take police officers' word and their reports for some of the egregious situations that occurred. We had to go with the police report. We had to wait until those reports came out, and it was the reports, police reports, and many times coming from the prosecutor's office that indicated that it was an awful, egregious act, but it was one in which was lawful by police officers. I think with the advent of the cameras and the prevalence of citizens having videotaping and then the videotapes of businesses and so forth, we've learned that many of the situations that we're concerned about not only were egregious, but were illegal. And so that was made plain by the Breonna Taylor situation, but particularly the George Floyd matter of a couple of months back. That's why I told you that I thought that it had gone from lawful but awful to unlawful and still awful. In fact, beyond awful. So that was the moment that we kind of changed our perspective and our.
Let me ask you another question. As you rose through the ranks, can you relate to us how you began to address the instances of racist behavior by your fellow officers and subordinate officers, and what you did once you had command as a chief in the 3 police departments you commanded to stop that sort of thing?
You know, that's a great question, because I actually, one reason why I joined the Phoenix Police Department was because of my history with the Phoenix Police Department. Growing up here and seeing police officers do some really great things on the one hand, but many times as a Black person experiencing racist behavior by police officers. I joined the Phoenix Police Department, and some of my friends did, because we thought that we could make a difference, that during that period of time, again, back in the 60s, a lot of riots and a lot of protests and a lot of demonstrations. People were marching on the outside of the buildings, throwing rocks at the buildings, breaking windows, doing all the things that some people have done now. But it was not changing policing. And so I guess my intent for joining the Phoenix PD was to go on the inside, be on the inside and be able to make a difference. And as I joined the police department, I discovered that, Brooks, you've heard me say this before, if I had to write a book about policing and the people within policing over my lifetime, the book would be entitled In the Company of Heroes, because I have worked with some of the most amazing individuals, amazing human beings on this planet. Brave people who ran towards danger, all types of danger, when people ran the other direction, when people were frozen in indecision and not knowing what to do. Police officers and other public safety people, fire people, ran towards the problem. But I'd also have a chapter in that book that described some of the worst people that should not have ever been police officers and that were abusive and that took advantage of the badge and the reputation and the prestige of policing to demean people and to abuse them. I took the oath, and I want to read you guys the oath that you take when you become a police officer. It says, I, in your name, do solemnly swear and affirm that I will be alert and vigilant to enforce the criminal laws of this state, that I will not be influenced in any matter on account of personal bias or prejudice, that I will faithfully and impartially execute the duties of my office as a law enforcement officer according to the best of my skills, my abilities, and judgment. So help me God. I took that very seriously, and I was a very proud person when I graduated from the police academy in early 1970. The Phoenix Police Academy, having achieved that, was one of the finest moments of my life. However, the training officer, the person that I received as my training officer when I left the academy, would be in that chapter among the worst people that should have never been a police officer. I'll just give you this quick story. In the first week, and this was a white officer who had been on the police department for some time at that point. During the first week, and I'm in the vehicle, police vehicle with him, a call comes out. It's an emergency call at 16th Street in Washington. And if any of you are aware of Phoenix, have been in Phoenix for a while, 16th Street in Washington was a Black area with a few Black nightclubs and Black businesses, African-American businesses. And we were about, I'd say 6 blocks away, and an emergency traffic call came out. It had to do with some violence occurring there at 16th and 1. And when I'm ready to go, I mean, I've just read to you my charge, which is my oath to problem solve and to do the right thing. And as I started to drive, and he was allowing me to drive towards 16th and Washington, he said, hey, where are you going? What are you doing? I said, well, we're going to drive over to 16th and see what's going on. We need to get there. He said, no. When calls come out, and he used the N-word, and I'm Black, and I'm sitting in the car. He says, when the call comes out at 16th Street in Washington, or places where those N-word people hang out, he says, drive slow, he says, you know what? When we get there, because they're all violent, if something happens, the winner will go to jail and the loser will go to the morgue, and we don't have to screw around with those damn people. That was my introduction during the first weeks. And it got worse in many ways from there. That I discovered that, you know, if you're arrested and you were a black male particularly, you were in trouble, because some of you might recall, people that might be, again, in my cohort group, you might remember that the Phoenix City Jail was on the other side of the Maricopa County building at 2nd Avenue in Washington. The jail was on the 4th floor. And if you weren't abused and beat up before you got to the front desk to get booked, when you got on that elevator to go to the 4th floor where the jail was, you had a little problem with police. They would find a reason to use their saps and their nightsticks on you in the elevator going to the 4th floor. So a lot of assumptions were made about Black people. And since the department was mostly white people, I was one of about 15 police officers out of about 2,500, 15 Black officers. A lot of assumptions about Black people and who they were, and Black males, and how they were, and how irresponsible and lazy, and how they didn't take care of their kids, and how they were less civilized, and that when there was an arrest had to be made, that the arrest was being made on behalf of our society. It was a good thing to get them off the streets. And so my point being is that there was a number of assumptions that the Phoenix Police Department was built on that had to do with how we treated Black people, African Americans, and males in particular, Hispanics in some cases, Indians for sure. And so my charge after being on the police department for not that long was to become a supervisor, a manager, a leader, that I could impact some of the assumptions and some of the policies that were built upon these racist assumptions. And so coming up the ranks, when I was a sergeant, I could control 8 people. When I was a lieutenant, and I made lieutenant very quickly, within 5 years, I was a lieutenant on the Phoenix PD, I could control a shift. When I made captain, I could control a district. When I was a major, I could control half the city. And the great thing about a organization that's built on levels and command is that your wishes becomes the way in which people will, officers, subordinates will behave. And what you reward, and I'll say this now because this will come up again, what you reward is what you get. And what citizens expect from their police department is what they'll get. And so I made it a point, coming up through the ranks of the Phoenix Police Department, at every level to implement what I consider to be policies that were much more humane, much more, that had a lot more to do with equity and equality and fair treatment, treating people like you would want to be treated, and holding police officers accountable. Spent a lot of time with discipline and various levels. And I did the same thing, and we can talk in more detail about that, but I did basically the same thing in each one of the departments that I went to. I was a strong believer in community policing, and I was a very strong believer in you reward what you want. And so not only did we reward valor and someone running down an alley and catching a bad guy, or someone making great arrest, but we also rewarded people who problem solved, who did things above and beyond in terms of just helping people, who were interested in procedural justice as much as law. In fact, one of the real problems that I try to emphasize, Brooks, is that law and order and law enforcement is very different than policing. That law enforcement emphasizes the word force, and policing, which is a gerund, which means practice, is a way of, just like if you're a lawyer or a doctor, you're practicing, that you're looking for ways to be better and you're constantly striving to be better. And so we rewarded those people who showed. And sooner or later, you start to get, when you change policies and you change assumptions and you reward what you're looking for, police officers, like everyone else, will try to please the decision makers. Say one other thing real quick, is that the systems aren't broken. Rotarians, the systems aren't broken. All these systems were designed, excuse me, were designed that way. They're designed to do exactly what they're doing, and that is to keep white people in power. And these systems come out of Jim Crow, when you had a black water fountain and a white water fountain, when you had a black school and a white school, when you had people that was redlined and couldn't get a loan from the bank or whatever it was. These systems have been in place for years, and it's time now for us to reimagine these systems and to do a better job. It's our time, your time, to step up and to make things different. And as we go along here, if we get an opportunity, I'll talk about more specific changes and reimagining in police departments that have to happen. I'll stop.
Okay, Kerry. I've got a few more questions, but I'm just going to cut it down to one because we've got people other than me asking questions. But I've often heard you, when you and I have talked about police procedures, and others with police command experience, say that the police all over the country have been charged with responding to all kinds of situations. That aren't really things that police are best trained and able to do. And what I'm wondering is, we hear the term defund the police, which I think is more appropriately downfund the police. Does downfunding the police respond to these things that you've talked about and others have talked about, that police officers are not the right ones to do, or is there a different way to accomplish that?
You know, that's a great question, and it's actually a multifaceted question. Because in a sense, I do believe that we ought to defund the police or downfund the police, as you just said. Because actually what's happened over time is that policing is over-assigned. Whenever society couldn't figure out what to do with something, they said, give it to the police. And these are many times the most inequipped people to deal with some of the issues that we're faced with in our society. Think about this. At 2 o'clock in the morning, when there is a problem with a mentally ill person, a person that is struggling mentally, with a family member or with families or whatever, or at 2 o'clock in the morning when a homeless person is starting to unravel, you have a junior police officer, because he or she does not have seniority to work days because they are so new, and you have a junior supervisor who doesn't have the seniority to be at a different time. And so these people who are junior and who are not trained in dealing with the homeless or the mentally ill, or to deal with the abuse situations that come up, or many of the issues that society is dealing with, these are the people who are dealing with it in the middle of the night. And so I've said for years, all those people who love to say, oh, I advocate on behalf of kids, or I am interested in dealing with the homeless, or I'm very much interested in dealing with the mentally ill, and I want to be effective. What I want to do is I want to come down and I want to train police officers how to do it. I have a PhD. I'm working from 8 to 5, And when police officers really need you, you are saying, give us a report and I'll follow up in the morning. The problem is that police officers have been asked to do, work with people that they're ill-equipped to work with. Police officers are there to seize time and to bring violent situations back to normal. They can't make normal better. Normal is the problem. If you're trying to seize time and bring bring situations back to normal. So, Brooks, I would just say that we've been overassigned, police have been overassigned, and it's time now to rethink, not so much defund, but to rethink how and reimagine how police officers and how police departments are assigned and what we expect from them. And many times, many times in my career, I've seen us get into trouble, us meaning police departments or policing, wind up in trouble because we're called on to solve issues that we're ill-equipped to solve. And so part of this look, and I think that the people who holler for defunding police don't remember the 80s. They don't really remember when crime was really sky high and we went to community policing. But they do have a point in the sense that maybe this is an opportunity to reimagine the kind of partnerships that police officers and police departments have in the community to really solve problems.
Okay, I've got two questions. Can you please explain what seems to be the outsized power of police unions to deter the firing of bad officers? And a lot of people are making this topic into a political matter. In my opinion, this is a police union problem, not who is in office. What do you think?
So I'd say top 5 issues that we as a society will have to deal with when we talk about reimagining policing, I'd say within the top 5, dealing with police unions would be one of them. And the reason why that is because our politicians, and someone mentioned politicians, over the years, when cities and towns and jurisdictions didn't have money to give raises to police officers, the unions would negotiate with politicians, city councils, mayors, and they would ask for a 15% raise, 10% raise. And of course, the budgeteers would say, we don't have that kind of money. We can't give you a raise. And so they'll negotiate with the unions. And by the way, there are no police chiefs at the table for the negotiations. It's usually the union meeting with the mayor, meeting with the city council members, meeting with city managers, those kinds of people. The police chief is generally left out of that conversation. And so when they didn't have the money, the unions were smart enough not just here, but I'm talking about across the country, police unions were smart enough to say, well, we understand that you don't have the money, but we would like to have this management prerogative or this management prerogative. We would like to have 3 of our employees assigned 24/7 at the union office to be able to represent our fellow officers. We would like to have raises for the union leadership. We would like to have vehicles for the union membership. And we would like to make sure that before a police officer is investigated, or fired or disciplined, that these things would happen. And the city council, city manager, mayors would agree to that. And what we have is an example. When I was a police chief in Detroit, we had an individual on the police department that had been involved in 3 separate shootings. Each one of them was not a good shooting. They were out of policy. People wound up being killed. And when I got there, this person this officer was still on the police department. And what was really amazing, because we were trying to get rid of him and the union fought us tooth and nail, what was really interesting is that he was on the supervisor's, the sergeant's list to be promoted. And I wound up having to go to court to keep the union and for keeping this person from being promoted to sergeant. And the court told me that the union contract was such that I had to promote this gentleman. And so what happened is that during my tenure in Detroit, there were no promotions because of, if I had one promotion, I had to promote this person. So all of the promotions were interim promotions. They were just temporary promotions, no permanent promotion, so that I wouldn't have to promote this gentleman. But the unions are very powerful, and they're powerful not because of just their unions, they're powerful because they have the money and they have the wherewithal to work with decision makers, political decision makers, mayors, city council members, and so forth, to just about take away all of the management prerogatives of police chiefs. So one of the ways in which Steve and the other person that asked the question, one of the ways that has to happen is when we reimagine policing, it's got to be done at a federal level. It's got to be done with the Justice Department involved with a consent decree. And it has to be that we are ignoring or retracting some of the management prerogatives that have been over the years. And that's the only way I think it will occur, is that we just have to have a consent decree with the government, with the federal government, to sidestep some of the issues with the unions.
Okay. I read there are two things that will make a meaningful impact on Black advancement: choice in education and changing Black culture to embrace having husbands, a responsible man in Black households. President Obama tried to stress a man in the house. What are your thoughts?
Well, like I said, I think that there are many assumptions about why Black males are involved in situations that they're in. And many times it has to do with what we've talked about, and it has to do with the systemic or institutionalized racism that has been built. I know it's easy to look at the surface and say, well, somehow these men don't take care of their families and don't take care of their kids. But when I was police chief in Richmond, there were about 7 housing project areas, and mostly moms and kids, young men and their moms, which is not a good formula. And Georgia, I would just tell you that the reason why that was is because the institutions that have rewarded Black dads, but I'm talking about basically poor people, for not being around. Their families do better when they're not there. The welfare system, and it affects white folks too. Poor white people in many of the places in Appalachia and many of those places, they behave the same way. It's not just Black people or not just Hispanic people. They behave the same way because the rules enforce them to basically not be around. And so what happens is they're not there during the day when the inspections occur because there's a penalty for dads being in the household. There's no penalty if they come at night. There's no penalty when the other people, the enforcers, aren't around. So that's another one of those systems, I said, that has to be looked at and rethought. The welfare system, how people are rewarded for having kids and not taking care of their kids. That's a systemic issue that's got to be addressed. Okay, and also, yeah, you mentioned about education. Education is very, very important for everybody. It's important for Black people, important for white people. In fact, I'm hoping that that's what we're doing right now as we're sitting here, is that some people become educated about what's really going on with the whole Black Lives Matter issue and how that's been hijacked in a way. But yeah, I believe that education is important. I believe that dads, Black men in families, if we're talking about Black people, that's important. I believe that we need to take a look at the systems to see why is that happening and why does it continue to happen even when President Obama put programs in place. There are counter programs. There are other situations that causes that. People aren't inherently bad or mean or irresponsible. It's the systems that we find ourselves dealing with that causes many of the problems, and they're based on some assumptions that are incorrect, and many of the assumptions are racist.
Tony writes, what will you tell one of your sons if he says he wants to be a policeman? And then my question is, I've often heard something people refer to as the talk that Black and brown families have to give their sons and daughters as they start to reach their teenage years. What would it take to get to the point where the talk is no longer necessary?
Oh, that's a great question. First of all, my son did go into policing and just recently retired from the Phoenix Police Department. He had a great career. I would say that the talk my parents had with me, I had with him, and I still have for some of you that know Felicia and I, we still have 3 young men that still hang around every once in a while. We haven't been able to run them off yet. But 2 of them just turned 21 and one is 18 years old, or soon will be. And we have had the talk many times. We've taken situations that have occurred and said to them, hey, when you're out in the world and you are stopped by a police officer and engaged with a police officer, cooperate. I would much rather for you to cooperate and to do whatever it is that they're asking you to do at the time than to wind up being dead right. I would prefer that you totally, we tell them about making sure that their hands are in sight. If a police officer stops them, we talk about making sure that when they reach for their wallet, sometimes even having your wallet on your dashboard, making sure that you don't have any furtive movement, that kind of thing, to give anybody an excuse. Now, many police officers, as I said at the outset, are good people. And if you're stopped, they're probably doing exactly what they should be doing. But as I said, there's a chapter that will be written about people that should never have been police officers in the first place. That's one of the things on my top 5 list that we could talk about is how do we do that? How do we do a better job of selecting police officers that aren't bigoted, that are ignorant in many ways, don't know with how to deal with people outside of their own sphere of influence, that kind of thing. And I've seen much of that. And just by chance, that might be one of the police officers that stopped my son. And I want them not to have an excuse to shoot my son or to do something silly. And I've seen of late here in Phoenix, police officers, and many times I pity Jerry Williams, the police chief here, who is trying to make some sense of some of the things that police officers do or have done recently. And you just, as a police officer myself, you have to wonder, what in the hell were they thinking when they did this? When they created this situation where they couldn't de-escalate it and move away, they then forced the issue. And so I just tell my kids, tell my son, I tell my grandkids, young males, the same thing. And that is, police officers, stop you, comply, and we'll deal with it later. To deal with the inequity later, but I don't want you trying to deal with it out there on the street in the heat of the moment.
You were part of a police department in white majority Phoenix, in Richmond, a city with 50-50 racial balance, and in Detroit, a black majority city. Can you compare the police treatment of black citizens in each city?
Yeah.
And let's say brown citizens there too, because we have a lot of Hispanic citizens here in Arizona.
Absolutely. And Roger, that's a great question. What I've seen is that for different reasons, the relationships with the Black community or the Hispanic community still different. Here in Phoenix, I think that we like to think, and I think for the most part, we are a leading department in the country. I think that we have most of the officers that are on the police department, I think they have their heart in the right place. They would want to. There is a percentage that I don't think so. But here's the problem in Phoenix, that the more African-American police officers we have, the less those assumptions that I talked about, the biases are played out. As a Black officer, when I worked South Phoenix or worked in an area that was predominantly Black, an expression on a Black person's face did not necessarily mean that they were angry, or a word that they said didn't mean that that was something that was challenging me as a police officer. Or if we were talking in the street, it wasn't a problem. It wasn't a problem for me to stand in the street and talk to him. I didn't make it an issue to get back up on the sidewalk. Let's talk on the sidewalk. In other words, I understood as a Black person dealing with Black people, I understood that there was that the culture is different, that people say, do, behave differently without being a threat. And I also understood as a Black police officer dealing with Black people, the kinds of things that was really important to them in their culture. What's an insult and what's not an insult to that person? When a guy is in front of his family, things that you don't want to say, you don't want to push him to the brink if you don't want to have a fight. And once you escalate that, then you've got a real problem on your hands. In other words, there are just a lot of little indignities sometimes that white officers don't quite understand because they come from a different culture. And it's not just policing. It's like that in teachers with students. It's like that with all kinds of stuff. And so it's really important, I think it's really important that we have that kind of understanding. Now, so the more African Americans, the more Hispanics, the more Asians, the more women you have on the police department, the less opportunity you have for that to be offended, for people to be offended. Okay, now in Richmond and in Detroit, there were predominantly Black cities. You still had a problem because you had predominantly Black cities with predominantly white police departments. And even in Detroit, the police department was still predominantly white. And they still had friction between police departments and the community. And not every officer, I want to keep reminding everybody that I'm not talking about every officer, but I am talking about officers that don't really quite understand the culture that they're working in and the people that they're working with and the circumstances that they find people in. I think it's really, really important. One of the things, again, on that top 5 list is that police officers, all of them, should not be hired with just a high school education. We should have police officers, the job of being a police officer today is so complex. The rules, the laws, the Supreme Court decisions, all of those things are really, really important. And to have some person that never went any further than a high school, that never took a sociology class, never thought much about, how people interact, never thought about the bigger picture, have a larger world view, they shouldn't be police officers. And so many times in places like Richmond, the cradle of the Confederacy, or Detroit, the chocolate city, Motown. Many times the police officers that you have there have been there for a long time, and many of them don't have any kind of idea about a worldview that's inclusive or problem solving, that they're there to solve problems, that they're there to be a resource, that they're there for the spirit, they're hired in the spirit of service and not in the spirit of being an enforcer or the spirit of being a guardian of the community.
If you were the chief of police in Portland, Oregon, and had the authority as you saw fit, what action would you take to quell the insurrection that's arisen there?
Well, Portland, Oregon is a really interesting, from a Black perspective, is a very interesting situation that's occurred. I mentioned earlier that Black Lives Matter is important, but it's been hijacked. So let's look at the demographics of Portland. It's like 5% African American. It's like 80-point-something% Caucasian. And then the rest are Asians or Pacific Islanders. Very few Black people in Portland, Oregon. If you've ever been there, it's a great city, but it's mostly white. And so the idea that you would have all of these white people in the 50th and 60th day still claiming to be in support of George Floyd and his murder, and to destroy buildings, set fires in the name of Black Lives Matter, is hijacking the situation. I mean, so from my standpoint, federal buildings need to be protected. The community needs to be protected. I would not have done what they did in Seattle. That's hijacking the sentiment of what the whole George Floyd issue is about equality and about, you know, one of the great things that John Lewis left us with was good trouble, the statement about good trouble, and that it's nonviolent. But the protest and about the injustice and the violence against Black people have been hijacked by white people and other people, and again, from my perspective. Now that raising all kinds of concerns, all kinds of fears about what's going on, and it's being blamed on Black Lives Matter, all those Black people up there. There's no hardly any Black people in Portland. So my thought about Portland, quite honestly, is that we need to, police officers policing in the ways in which we need to do it, which is intelligent, humane, but the rock and the sock. And that is soft to the touch, but very much a solid foundation in terms of bringing that whole situation back to normal. And I have said earlier, normal is the problem, but I think that many times in situations like what we're talking about, the protest has been hijacked, and that the people who are doing it are doing it for very different reasons. In fact, detrimental reasons to the cause.
Police misconduct costs us hundreds of millions of dollars a year nationally. In Phoenix alone, it costs just under $3 million a year. We're paying for policing as taxpayers and paying for their mistakes. How do we as taxpayers hold the officers financially accountable so we're not paying for their mistakes?
That's a great question too. First of all, I do think that police officers ought to be held accountable, just like every other citizen when they are when they're wrong and when they do egregious things, just like in the George Floyd murder. I believe that police officers ought to be held accountable. I think we're in a very litigious society, and they will look for the deep pockets, whoever the plaintiffs are, they'll look for the deep pockets. And so they'll always look to the city. But In the past, to be honest about it, in the past, police officers, because of the unions, because of contracts, because of sympathy towards police officers, and because, honestly, the Supreme Court decision that happened in 1989, I believe, is the Graham versus decision that gave police officers almost the right to do just about anything they needed to do and be able to justify it when it comes to violence. I think we've moved away from that a bit. I think people are being held more accountable. Again, of the top 5 things that need to happen to reimagine police departments would be to hold police officers and police departments more accountable. I believe that in some cases, police supervisors need to be held accountable to some of these egregious things, because police supervisors are responsible for the people that work for them and the training that they received and the documentation of their behavior and their performance. And generally, this is not the first time. It's not the first time. The gentleman the officer that killed George Floyd has a long history of being brutal and being inappropriate and out of policy. And supervisors and managers needed to have acted on that to the extent that they could. And so when they didn't, I think in some cases they need to be held accountable too. But she's right. The questioner said, lots of money goes towards police mistakes or police inequities and lawsuits and so forth. And my belief is that they should be held accountable, and which should make police departments and police cities and city administrations do a lot more in terms of the training and the exposure that these police officers receive, and a better selection process as well, selecting better police officers from the beginning.
I received actually a question from someone who lives actually in Vancouver, Washington, across the river from Portland. And she's asking, Beth Ford, when you say that BLM has been hijacked by white people, do you mean that you believe the protesters in Portland don't believe that Black Lives Matter, even the peaceful protesters? Do you agree with how the Trump administration is using military forces to arrest protesters in Portland?
Okay. I do believe that there is a fraction or part of this group that, of course, believe that Black Lives Matter. Black lives do matter. I mean, this is an important, it's an important issue. It's an important statement. People have tried to make it into a lot that it's not. They've hooked it up with, socialism. I read some people say about the intent for Black Lives Matter. And it has, in a way, been hijacked, or if you want to say that in a way, is the meaning and the direction has been diverted. So I believe that, yeah, there's a fraction of people there in that group, the protests, that are legitimate. But I do think that there's a larger fraction that is bent on something other than equity for African Americans or for minorities or people of color or whatever. And that I don't know from a policing standpoint how burning and looting a federal building has anything to do with Black Lives Matter or for the movement for that matter. And so I believe that that building, just like our buildings here, our federal buildings in Arizona, needs to be protected. That's what law enforcement and policing do. I mean, that's part of what we should be doing. And so, unfortunately, the president, from a political standpoint, has decided to send in federal resources. I believe, though, that the local police and I'm not just talking about Portland police, but I'm talking about there are many jurisdictions there, have the ability to protect those buildings and to humanely, but firmly deal with the protesters.
Okay, I got two more questions. A quick one. How have body cameras helped or not helped the police?
Body cameras have been, in my view, again, as a police chief and as an administrator and as a person who's called on to hold people accountable to investigate situations where police officers police officers and other people have been in some conflict or some controversy, cameras have been invaluable in actually having the evidence that you need, both positively and negatively. Exonerating police officers, training police officers, and when necessary, disciplining police officers. I think it's a great innovation. I think that, again, when we're dealing with the unions, there's issues that come up because unions want police officers to have an opportunity to view the videos before decisions are made or before investigations are instituted. But from my standpoint, they have been a real positive step for police officers and police supervision and police management, police departments around the country. I think most police chiefs around the country, most progressive police chiefs, and by the way, I would want you guys to know that there are about 18,000 police departments in this country, and I would say there's only about 60 or 70 major city chiefs and 60 or 70 major cities that I believe are progressive. Many police departments, unfortunately, are 5 and 6 and 7, maybe 10-person departments in very small places that sometimes don't get the training, don't get the word, aren't professional in the way in which they treat people, and all police departments get painted with those brushes as well.
Okay, and finally, I've got two related questions, specifically Rotary related. Do you feel Rotary is diverse and inclusive? And if not, what do you feel Rotary clubs can do to address to be more diverse and inclusive? And what actions can Rotarians take to support positive change?
Oh, both good questions. First, Tony's question. In my year, I think you would say, and I think the club would say, that we tried to do some different things with our club to make it more appealing to not only minorities, but to younger people. And my view, honestly, is that, and I've mentioned this, Craig and I actually talked about this week, Craig Wilson and I, former district governor Craig Wilson, about this week, and that my feeling was that I had, let me back up just a second real quick. I had a person who is a meetings specialist come in and spend 2 or 3 meeting periods, Fridays in those days, Fridays with us, just looking at our club and trying to think through what would be a better meeting format and would be more attractive. I included many of what this person, again, professional person on developing meetings for organizations, I included many of those innovations, in my word, innovation, in the meetings that I had back when I was the 100th president in our centennial year. We had a great year, I believe. I had a lot of fun. I have the best memories, some of the best memories of my life, being in Rotary and being Rotary 100th, the 100th president. We had a great year. Unfortunately, the next year, we went right back to doing what we were doing before. Some of the things that we were doing during my year, people just was resistant to. I think the problem with Rotary right now is that we're so locked in to doing what we've always done. The meetings are by rote. We come in and we say a prayer, we sing a song, and we have a program. And we're there for about an hour and a half and then we're gone. And we do good. I'm not saying that we don't do good. I'm just saying that there's not a lot of innovation. Why would I, if I'm African American and everybody there is professing to be, a Trumper or a Rotary person or whatever, a Republican or whatever, and they do that there at the meetings, people are going to show up. They'll show up for a while and then they're going to leave. Then they're not going to come back. They're going to feel uncomfortable. We've got to make Rotary meetings comfortable, where people feel like they're included and that you really want them there, and that programs have to be much more interesting to a broader range of people. So that's what I would say from a Rotary standpoint. And now, Nancy asked, what can Rotarians do? And here's what I've been telling my neighbors. I've been telling all my friends, my good white friends, because Felicia and I have had several meetings with our neighbors, and they're all saying the same thing. What can we do? Well, I said, it's not good enough just to say, I'm not a racist. You've got to be an anti-racist, which means that you need to educate yourself about the issues. Honestly, educate yourself about the issues that are affecting Black people, people of color. Because you're white, you don't have to deal with a lot of the issues, the slights, and the other issues that are still remaining. You can, it's easy for you to say, well, what do they want? I don't know what these people want. What's wrong with them? It's easy to say that when you're not educated about what's going on around you. When Jim Crow is still affecting a lot of people. I've had an amazingly successful career not only just as a Black person, but as a person, as a human, as an American. But I still feel it. I still see it. It's still happening. So one thing, Nancy, we can do as Rotarians is to educate ourselves about what's going on in the world for real. So one of the things that Craig and I talked about the other night, I said, Craig, what I told my neighbors, I gave them a list of books: White Fragility, The New Jim Crow, Stamped from the Beginning. A whole list of books is right here on my shelf. Hey, read some of these books and see what people are saying, and then maybe you'll have an aha moment. And then talk to other people, talk to other white people when Black people aren't around. And when they say stuff that is racist or stupid, then you correct them. My feeling is, if everybody would, each one teach one kind of a thing, each one reach one kind of a thing, then we would go a long way in solving a lot of the issues that we're having. So Rotary, what we can do, wouldn't it be great if we and our Rotary Club adopted a book, one of the books that I just mentioned, or any number of books, and assign that, ask the Rotarians to read the book, and then a month, maybe give them a month to read it, and then have several programs where we're the program, the members of the program, and we then spend time talking about what we learned from the book. And what we learned might then help us to invite speakers that will say things that will make us uncomfortable. Because if you don't stir the water, and if you're not uncomfortable, you're not gonna make any changes. When they had the Boston Tea Party, when they threw all that tea up in Boston into the harbor, they were stirring the pot. They were making things happen. They were in good trouble. And so what I'm saying is, learn how to be in good trouble in your sphere of influence.
Jerry, thank you. Thank you so much. By the way, I have read White Fragility, and I am currently reading How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Right.
I'm finding How to Be an Anti-Racist, while not letting me off the hook at all, is a much more relatable, and maybe that's because of my whiteness, but it's a much more relatable book to me. So I guess and you may differ, but my recommendation for those of us who have been raised with a white outlook, because that's all we've ever known,
right,
that you might try reading How to Be an Anti-Racist first. Um, I think it's a better written book than White Fragility.
Yeah, well, the one thing about White Fragility is it's written by D'Angelo, which is a Caucasian woman, and Ibram is the author of How Not to Be a Racist, Anti-Racist. And so that's a little bit different perspective, but I appreciate that. I think any way of educating ourselves about each other. You know, Black folks have always had to learn about white people. One conversation I've had recently is I asked my neighbor, how would you feel about going to an all-Black church where you're the only white person in the church? Think about that. How do you feel about that? Would you feel uncomfortable? Would you feel like that some bad thing's going to happen? Would you be nervous? And he said, yeah, and why? And he said, probably I'd be a little nervous and uncomfortable, and you know, but if they welcomed me, then everything would be great. I said, well, I want you to know something. Growing up in Phoenix, that's the way it is for me. I have been in all kinds of situations, including Rotary, where I was the only Black person in the room. So it's good to get outside of who you are and where you are to learn about how other people are feeling as well. And I think that book that you just described, and many, they're on the top 20 list right now, the New York bestsellers. There are probably about 5 or 6 books that Rotarians could use to deal with some of the issues and to answer Nancy's question about how can we make a difference.